Hello, my name is Tammy Miller. In this video, we will compare E1 versus E2 solvents. To compare the solvents used for E1 and E2 reactions, we need to look at the reactions individually to determine what they need. For an E1 reaction, we require a polar protic solvent. We discussed what a polar protic solvent is in our classify polar solvents as protic or aprotic. E1 reactions require a protic solvent because the E1 reaction proceeds through a carbocation intermediate. The polar protic solvent is used to hydrogen bond with and stabilize that carbocation intermediate. Therefore, E1 reactions always require a polar protic solvent. E2 reactions, on the other hand, require a polar aprotic solvent. This is because E2 reactions do not proceed through a carbocation intermediate. So a polar protic solvent is not necessary for hydrogen bonding and stabilization. When we look at an E2 reaction, polar aprotic solvents allow the strong base that is necessary for an E2 reaction to attack the substrate instead of deprotonating the solvent. If we used a polar protic solvent, the strong base would react with the solvent and not with the substrate, and this is not what we want. Finally, the aprotic solvent can sometimes be the conjugate acid of a base that is being used as the strong base for the attack on the substrate. If it is a conjugate acid, it will be an aprotic solvent. Sometimes in organic chemistry, we're given situations and we need to understand which solvent we need to use. We're going to look at a question about that. An organic chemistry student is asked to choose a solvent from the cabinet to use in an E1 reaction. To ensure that the reaction proceeds correctly, which solvent should he use and why? So the first thing I need to do is I need to think about what happens in an E1 reaction. I know that an E1 reaction is going to proceed through a carbocation intermediate. And I know that that carbocation intermediate is going to need a polar protic solvent to help stabilize that intermediate. So what I do is I look at each of these solvents individually to determine which one is the polar protic solvent. The first solvent in the cabinet is ethyl acetate. When I look at ethyl acetate, I do see that there is some polarity here due to the carbon and oxygen bonds. But when I look at the hydrogens, none of them is attached to an oxygen. So this cannot be a protic solvent. So this is an aprotic solvent. Because it's an aprotic solvent, I cannot use it for an E1 reaction. Our second solvent is acetic acid. When I look at acetic acid, I do see, again, the polarity here. I also see that the hydrogen, there is a hydrogen attached to an oxygen. Therefore, this is a polar and it is a protic solvent. Because this is a protic solvent, it can hydrogen bond with and it can stabilize that carbocation intermediate. Acetic acid is a wonderful solvent for an E1 reaction. The final solvent that our student has to choose from is acetone. When I look at acetone, I definitely have polarity here. But again, just like with ethyl acetate, when I look at the hydrogens, none of them are attached to oxygens. So this is indeed an aprotic solvent. Again, an aprotic solvent is not a good solvent for an E1 reaction. By understanding what a reaction is and what is necessary for a reaction to proceed, we can easily determine what solvent we need to use for our reaction.